You think you know how the world works. The loud get heard, the rich get richer, and the invisible stay invisible. But sometimes the most powerful man in the room is the one everyone ignores. And sometimes the only person who truly sees him is the woman with nothing left to lose. The arches of Sarah's feet were screaming. It was a dull, throbbing ache that started in her cheap, black, slip-resistant shoes and radiated all the way up to her lower back. She shifted her weight, balancing a silver tray loaded with 12 flutes of vintage champagne. Condensation beaded on the thin glass. She did the mental math. 1 dropped glass equaled 2 hours of wages. 2 dropped glasses meant she'd have to choose between keeping the heat on this week or buying her son, Leo. No, she couldn't use that name. Her son, Toby. Choosing between the heat and Toby's asthma medication, she gripped the tray tighter. The grand ballroom of the Grand Hotel was a sea of bespoke suits and aggressive networking. It was the annual Pacific Rim Tech Summit. To Sarah, it was just another catering gig. The room smelled of expensive gin, desperation, and the kind of cologne that costs more than her monthly rent. She navigated through the crowd, a ghost in a black vest and white button-down. She was 32, a single mother, and utterly invisible. And that was fine. Invisibility was a shield. When the wealthy and powerful didn't see you, they didn't demand things from you. They didn't direct their casual cruelty your way. "Champagne, sir?" she asked, offering the tray to a knot of men arguing loudly about market shares. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Richard, snatched a glass without looking at her. He was mid-sentence, his voice booming over the low hum of the room. "I'm telling you, the acquisition is a lock. The Japanese investors are too conservative. They don't have the stomach for aggressive expansion." Sarah moved on. She despised these events. The people here didn't converse. They pitched. They didn't listen. They waited for their turn to speak. She drifted toward the perimeter of the room, near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. That was where she saw him. He was sitting on a plush velvet armchair tucked behind a ridiculous, oversized fake ficus tree. He looked to be in his late 50s, Japanese. He wore a navy suit that was impeccably tailored but entirely unassuming. No flashy watch, no diamond cufflinks. Just a man sitting alone, staring into a glass of sparkling water. Sarah recognized his type. Not the billionaire type. She didn't know what that looked like up close. She recognized the exhausted type, the slump of the shoulders, the heavy, slow blink of the eyes. He rubbed his temples with his thumb and forefinger, a universal gesture for a headache that was settling in for the night. A group of younger executives strutted past him. Richard was leading the pack. "Who's the old guy?" one of Richard's associates muttered, nodding toward the seated man. Richard glanced over, his eyes scanning the man's plain suit and lack of an entourage. "Nobody. Probably a mid-level supplier from overseas. Doesn't even speak English, I bet. Don't waste your time." They walked on, their laughter trailing behind them like exhaust fumes. Sarah watched the exchange. Her jaw tightened. The casual dismissal, the arrogance. She had spent 3 years living in Kyoto in her early 20s, running away from a suffocating hometown and a bad relationship, teaching English to businessmen just like the one sitting in the chair. She knew the crushing weight of Japanese corporate culture. She knew the quiet dignity it demanded. She looked at her tray. 2 glasses of champagne left. She looked at the man. He was named Ray. At least that was the name on the laminated badge resting on his lap. Ray. A simple Western name, likely adopted to make things easier for men exactly like Richard. Men who couldn't be bothered to learn a 3-syllable foreign name. Ray took a sip of his water and winced slightly. He was massaging the back of his neck now. Sarah checked her watch. 10 minutes until her scheduled break. She could go to the kitchen, sit on an overturned milk crate, and eat a stale bread roll. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked toward the catering station in the corner. She set her tray down. She grabbed a small, heavy ceramic mug, dropped a slice of fresh lemon into it, and filled it with hot water from the tea urn. She picked up a small plate, arranged 3 delicate cucumber sandwiches on it, and walked back across the room. The ballroom was getting louder. The alcohol was doing its job, stripping away the thin veneer of professional courtesy and revealing the raw, grasping ambition beneath. Sarah weaved through the bodies, her eyes locked on the quiet corner behind the ficus tree. Ray was still there. He had closed his eyes. Sarah stopped beside his chair. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't offer a fake customer service smile. She just stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle between them, a tiny pocket of calm in the chaotic room. He opened his eyes. They were dark, sharp, and profoundly tired. He looked at her, then at the hot water and the plate of food in her hands. "I didn't order this," he said. His English was flawless, carrying a deep, resonant timbre. "I know," Sarah said. Sarah knelt slightly, placing the mug of hot water and the small plate on the low glass table beside his chair. "Champagne makes a headache worse," she said flatly, keeping her voice low. "And the crab puffs are mostly mayonnaise. You haven't eaten anything since the keynote speech at 4 o'clock. Ray blinked, surprised. He leaned forward, looking at the hot lemon water. The steam curled into the air between them. "You were watching me. I watch everyone," Sarah said. She straightened up, brushing a crumb off her black vest. "It's my job to see what people need before they know they need it. And you look like you need a quiet room in a dark corner. I can't give you the room, but I can bring you the water." A faint, dry smile touched the corners of Ray's mouth. "Thank you. That is very observant of you." He reached for the mug. As his fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic, Sarah noticed the slight tremor in his hand. It wasn't age. It was burnout. It was the physical manifestation of flying across 14 time zones, sitting in endless meetings, and navigating a sea of strangers who only wanted to extract value from him. Sarah looked at him. She didn't see a VIP. She saw her former landlord in Kyoto, a man who worked himself to the bone to put 2 daughters through university. She saw the weary commuters on the Hankyu line, sleeping standing up. Without thinking, she let the heavy professional mask slip, just for a second. "Otsukare-sama desu," Sarah said softly. The words hung in the air. "Otsukare-sama desu," a phrase with no direct English translation. It didn't just mean good job or hello. It meant, "You are tired, and I recognize your hard work. I see the burden you are carrying." It was a phrase of profound communal empathy. Ray froze. The mug stopped halfway to his mouth. He slowly lowered it back to the table. He looked up at Sarah, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. The exhaustion in his eyes was suddenly replaced by a sharp, piercing clarity. The air around him seemed to change, the quiet resignation vanishing, replaced by a sudden, intense presence. He was speechless. For 5 long seconds, the billionaire CEO of one of the largest tech manufacturing firms in the world simply stared at a waitress in a cheap uniform. "Where?" Ray started, his voice barely above a whisper, shifting effortlessly into Japanese. "Where did you learn to speak to me like that?" Sarah kept her posture relaxed, switching to Japanese just as smoothly. "I lived in Kyoto for 3 years. My neighbors taught me. They told me that hard work deserves to be seen, even if it is not rewarded." Ray let out a breath that sounded like a laugh, though his face remained serious. He leaned back in his chair. He switched back to English, perhaps to keep the playing field level. "Most people in this room think I don't speak English. They think I am a minor supplier, a nobody." "Most people in this room are idiots," Sarah said simply. "They look at the clothes, not the person. They listen to the volume, not the words." "And what do you see?" Ray asked. It wasn't a casual question. It was an interrogation. "I see a man who is bone-tired," Sarah replied, holding his gaze. "I see someone who is carrying the weight of a lot of other people's livelihoods. And I see someone who would rather be anywhere else but here." Ray stared at her. "You are very blunt." "I make $14 an hour, sir," Sarah said, the cynicism bleeding into her tone. "I can't afford to be anything else." Before Ray could answer, a loud voice shattered the quiet corner. "Excuse me, sweetheart, you're blocking the light." It was Richard. He had circled back from the bar, a fresh glass of scotch in his hand, his face flushed with alcohol and self-importance. He didn't look at Sarah. He just waved his hand dismissively, expecting her to evaporate. Sarah felt the familiar spike of anger, but she clamped it down. She took a step back, reverting to the invisible servant. Richard loomed over Ray. "Hey, buddy," he said loudly, speaking slowly as if talking to a child. "You having a good time? Enjoying the free drinks?" Ray did not look at Richard. He did not move. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on Sarah. The transformation was absolute. The tired, unassuming man vanished. In his place sat a predator. "I asked you a question, pal," Richard said, his smile faltering slightly, annoyed by the lack of response. Ray finally shifted his gaze to Richard. His eyes were flat, devoid of any warmth. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the chilling weight of a man who could destroy a career with a single phone call. "I do not know you," Ray said, his English perfectly clipped, carrying an aristocratic edge that hadn't been there a moment ago. "And I did not invite you to interrupt my conversation." Richard blinked, thrown off by the flawless English and the absolute authority in the tone. "Oh, sorry. I didn't realize. I'm Richard from Apex Solutions. We're the ones pitching the new—" "I know who you are," Ray interrupted softly. "Your proposal crossed my desk yesterday morning. It lacked vision. It relied entirely on aggressive short-term margins and neglected long-term infrastructure." Ray picked up his hot water. It was declined. Richard's face drained of color. The scotch sloshed in his glass. "Declined? Wait, you're not—" "My name is Ray," he said softly. "My company owns the firm you are attempting to acquire." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish pulled onto a dock. He looked at Ray, then at Sarah, entirely uncomprehending of the dynamic between the billionaire and the waitress. "Now," Ray said, turning his attention back to Sarah, completely dismissing Richard, "please, leave us." Richard practically tripped over his own expensive shoes, backing away, muttering frantic, incoherent apologies. Sarah watched him go. A dark, cynical satisfaction curled in her chest, but she didn't smile. She turned back to Ray. "That was cruel," she said. It was efficient, Ray corrected. He took a sip of the hot lemon water. He closed his eyes, savoring the warmth. You are right. It is much better than champagne. He set the mug down and looked at her name tag. Sarah. What is a woman who speaks fluent Japanese, understands the nuances of human behavior, and isn't afraid to insult an executive doing serving stale crab puffs? Surviving, Sarah said. The word tasted like copper in her mouth. It was the truth. I have a son. Toby. He needs things. The world doesn't pay you for understanding nuances, Ray. It pays you for holding the tray. Perhaps, Ray murmured. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't pull out a wallet. He pulled out a sleek black business card. It was completely blank except for a phone number and an email address. He placed it on the glass table next to the empty plate. I am flying back to Tokyo on Friday, Ray said. Before I leave, I am restructuring the American division of my company. I need people who can see the room, people who know when to speak, when to serve hot water, and when to cut through the noise. He looked up at her. Call that number tomorrow at 10 in the morning, Ray said. Ask for my assistant. Tell her you are the woman who reminded me what hard work looks like. Sarah stared at the card. It was just a small piece of black cardstock, but it felt like a heavy stone dropped into the stagnant pond of her life. I don't have a degree in business, Sarah said, her voice tight. She wasn't going to let herself hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope couldn't pay the rent. I didn't ask for a degree, Ray replied, standing up. He wasn't a tall man, but he suddenly commanded the entire space. I asked for you to call. He gave her a slight, deeply respectful bow, a gesture almost never given by a CEO to a waitress. Otsukare-sama desu, Sarah, he said quietly. Then he turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the tech bros and the desperate networkers completely behind, leaving Sarah standing alone with an empty tray, a blank card, and a sudden terrifying crack in her cynical armor. The apartment smelled of damp plaster and boiled pasta. Sarah locked the deadbolt, the sharp click echoing in the cramped hallway. It was 2 a.m. The silence of the apartment was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, wheezing sound of Toby's breathing from the single bedroom. She walked into the tiny kitchen, the linoleum cold against her stocking feet, and placed the blank black card on the scratch Formica counter. It looked absurd there, a piece of billionaire-grade cardstock sitting next to a stack of past-due electric bills and a plastic bottle of generic asthma syrup. She stared at it. The cynical voice in her head, the one that had kept her alive and relatively sane for the past 5 years, was screaming. It's a game, the voice said. Rich men play games. They get bored. They find a struggling person. They dangle a carrot and then they pull it away. It makes them feel like gods. Sarah poured herself a glass of tap water. It tasted metallic. She thought about Richard, the red-faced executive with the scotch. She thought about Ray sitting in the corner, holding the mug of hot water. He hadn't looked at her like a god looking at a peasant. He had looked at her like a drowning man who had just been thrown a rope. She walked into the bedroom. Toby was asleep, his chest rising and falling with a slight rattle. He was 6. He needed new winter boots. He needed a specialist for his lungs. He needed a mother who wasn't constantly vibrating with the low-level terror of imminent poverty. Sarah went back to the kitchen. She left the card on the counter. She would sleep on it. At 9:55 a.m., Sarah sat on the edge of her sagging sofa, staring at her cracked smartphone. Her thumb hovered over the keypad. She had already dressed for her morning shift at a local diner. Jeans, a faded blue polo shirt, sensible sneakers. Her stomach was a tight knot of acid and cheap coffee. At exactly 10 a.m., she dialed the number. It rang once. Mr. Takata's office. This is Diane. A crisp, professional voice answered. Sarah cleared her throat. Hi, my name is Sarah. I was told to call this number. By Ray. There was a pause on the line. The sound of typing. Ah, yes, Sarah. No last name provided. You are the woman from the catering staff at the Grand Hotel? Yes. Sarah braced herself for the brush-off. The polite refusal. Mr. Takata is expecting you, Diane said smoothly. He has a car waiting outside your building. It's a Blacktown car. The driver has your name. You are expected at the downtown corporate plaza in 20 minutes. Sarah stood up. She looked down at her faded polo shirt. I'm not dressed for a corporate office. I have a diner shift in an hour. Mr. Takata instructed me to tell you that your diner shift has been compensated for the week, Diane replied, completely unfazed. And he explicitly requested you come exactly as you are. He said, and I quote, "Do not put on a suit. We have enough suits." The car is waiting, Sarah. The line went dead. Sarah walked downstairs. The black car was idling by the curb, a jarring contrast to the overflowing dumpsters and cracked pavement of her street. The driver opened the door. She slid into the leather interior, the smell of money and cleanliness washing over her. 20 minutes later, she was standing in the penthouse suite of a glass skyscraper. The room was vast, minimalist, and terrifying. Walls of glass looked out over the city. Around a massive oak conference table sat 6 executives in sharp suits. They were arguing. The air was thick with tension, spreadsheets, and the sharp scent of stale coffee. Ray sat at the head of the table. He wore a crisp white shirt, no tie, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked just as tired as he had the night before, but the passive resignation was gone. He was razor sharp, his eyes tracking the conversation with predatory focus. He saw Sarah standing in the doorway. He raised a hand, silencing a balding man who was mid-rant about quarterly projections. "Sarah," Ray said, his voice cutting through the heavy air of the room. "Come in." The 6 executives turned to stare at her. Their eyes swept over her jeans, her faded polo, her scuffed sneakers. The judgment was palpable. It was a physical weight in the room. Who is this woman? Why is she here? Sarah kept her spine straight. She walked into the room, refusing to shrink. She remembered what she told him last night. Most people in this room are idiots. "Stand here," Ray instructed, pointing to the space right next to his chair. Sarah stood beside him. She felt wildly exposed. "We are negotiating a merger," Ray said, not looking at her, but speaking for her benefit. He gestured to the 3 men on the left side of the table. "This is the American Acquisitions team. They want to buy a logistics company in Osaka. They have been presenting their strategy for 2 hours. Ray turned his chair slightly, finally looking up at her. "Tell me what you see," the balding executive scoffed. "Ray, with all due respect, who is this? We are discussing a $60 million deal. We don't have time for—" He gestured vaguely at Sarah, unable to find a polite word for someone clearly beneath his tax bracket. Ray ignored him completely. He kept his eyes on Sarah. "Tell me what you see, Sarah. Look at the room. Look at the men. Use the same eyes you used on me last night." Sarah swallowed hard. This was the test. She looked at the table. She looked at the balding man who had just spoken. She noticed the way his left leg bounced under the table. She looked at the man next to him, who kept checking his watch, his breathing shallow. She looked at the printed spreadsheets scattered across the oak surface. They were heavily highlighted, covered in aggressive red ink. She took a breath. She dropped the catering persona. She let the cynical, observant survivor take the wheel. "They're lying," Sarah said flatly. The room went dead silent. The balding man's face turned magenta. "Excuse me?" Ray raised his hand again. Absolute silence fell. "Explain," Ray said quietly. "They're desperate," Sarah said, pointing a finger at the balding man. "His leg hasn't stopped shaking since I walked in. The guy next to him is sweating through a $1,000 suit, and it's freezing in here. Look at their papers." She gestured to the table. "They aren't presenting a strategy. They're defending a sinking ship. The red ink, the aggressive posture. They're trying to bulldoze you because if they stop talking, you'll realize they don't actually have the infrastructure they're promising. They want your money to fix a hole in their own boat, not to build a new one." She looked down at Ray. "They think because you're quiet, you're slow. They're trying to talk fast so you don't read the fine print." The silence in the room was absolute. The balding man opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at his shaking leg and forced it to stop. The damage was done. The panic in his eyes was naked and obvious. Ray leaned back in his chair. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It changed his entire demeanor, making him look 10 years younger. He looked at the American team. "The meeting is over," Ray said softly. "The deal is dead. Please see yourselves out." The executives didn't argue. The illusion was broken, and they knew it. They packed their briefcases in a flurry of embarrassed, angry silence and hurried out of the glass doors. When the room was empty, Ray stood up. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city. "You cost me 2 hours of my morning," Ray said to the glass, "but you saved me $60 million. "I just pointed out what was obvious," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. "Obvious to you," Ray corrected, turning around. "Not obvious to people who live their entire lives inside echo chambers of wealth and ego. They do not observe. They project. You survive by observing. That is a skill I cannot teach in a boardroom." He walked back to the table and picked up a manila folder. He held it out to her. "I told you I was restructuring," Ray said. "I spend half my year in America dealing with people who mistake my silence for weakness and my cultural courtesy for submission. I need a translator." "I only speak a little conversational Japanese, sir," Sarah said, taking the folder tentatively. "I do not need a language translator, Sarah. I speak English perfectly well," Ray said dryly. "I need a cultural translator. I need someone who reads the room. Someone who tells me when an executive is lying, when a partner is desperate, and when a negotiation is built on sand. I need someone who understands the human element that these spreadsheets ignore." Sarah opened the folder. Inside was a contract. It was a consultant position. The salary printed on the second page made the breath catch in her throat. It was a number she couldn't fully comprehend. It was Toby's lungs, fixed. It was a safe neighborhood. It was the end of the bone-deep terror. "Why?" Sarah whispered. She looked up at him, tears prickling the corners of her eyes, completely destroying her tough exterior. Why me? You could hire psychologists, profilers. Because a profiler would have brought me a psychological evaluation, Ray said. He walked closer, his expression softening into profound, grounded humanity. You brought me a hot lemon water because you saw a man in pain. You saw me, not the suit, not the money, me. He gestured to the contract. In Japan, we have a concept called kintsugi, Ray continued quietly. When a bowl is broken, we do not throw it away. We mend the cracks with gold. We believe the piece is more beautiful for having been broken. It has a history. It has survived. He looked at her faded polo shirt and her defensive posture. You have cracks, Sarah. The world has not been kind to you. But those cracks have made you perceptive. They have made you sharp. And they have made you capable of seeing the truth in a room full of expensive lies. I am not giving you charity. I am hiring a highly specialized asset. Sarah looked down at the contract. Her hands were shaking. She thought of the heavy silver tray, the cheap slip-resistant shoes, the endless, agonizing calculus of surviving on $14 an hour. She thought of the word invisible. She wasn't invisible anymore. I need to pick up my son at 3 o'clock, Sarah said, her voice thick but steady. She looked up and met the billionaire's eyes. Every day. I can't compromise on that. Ray nodded solemnly. The contract includes full autonomy over your schedule and comprehensive health coverage for your family. If there are other terms you require, we will negotiate them. He extended his hand. It wasn't the arrogant grasp of a power player. It was a steady, level offering. Welcome to the firm, Sarah, he said. Sarah reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm, grounding her in the reality of the moment. The cynical voice in her head, the one that had kept her alive for so long, finally went quiet. It didn't need to scream anymore. The war was over. Otsukare-sama desu, Mr. Takata, Sarah said, a real, genuine smile breaking across her face for the first time in years. Ray returned the smile, the weariness finally gone from his eyes. Otsukare-sama desu, Sarah. Sometimes, the greatest asset you bring to the table isn't a fancy degree or a ruthless pitch. It's your humanity. The struggles you've survived give you a vision that money can't buy. If this story reminded you that true power lies in empathy, observation, and seeing people for who they really are, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to know their hard work is seen, and subscribe for more stories that cut through the noise